Welcome back, everyone. So last time we had the opportunity to all respond to this first reading of Distance and Relation, and I thought that was a very informative, and I think it brought us together as a group around some of the themes that were raised, and so I hope that we can continue to explore these themes. I sent around a little write-up of what I thought the main themes were, and we'll look at that maybe very briefly in a minute, just to remind us. There are many things that we started to talk about, but that are still sort of up in the air. I feel like we've sort of like circus artists. We've put a lot of plates spinning up in the air, and now we need to make sure that they all stay up and that we do something with them. And we can maybe talk about also how we might do that. Vic and I were speaking earlier, and we were thinking it is such a wonderful collection of people, truly interdisciplinary, from many different backgrounds and different parts of the world. It would be fantastic to do something with that, maybe also in a more lasting sense. And so who knows, maybe towards the second semester or so, we could start to think about maybe a book project or a special issue for a journal or so, people who feel interested and called to write a bit about what the dialogical philosophy can mean today for people. That might be something that we could contemplate along the themes that we have that are beginning to emerge now. We can see about that. Well, there was so I sent around a little write-up to respond to Emily, and I'll put that on the share screen just now. I have your email addresses if you registered via the website, and if you're happy for me to put you on the email list, I will do that, and then you will get any kind of information that I'm sending out. For those of you who are first time here now, there is a Google Drive, a shared Google Drive folder, which has a lot of literature in it, and more will come as we go on. But I need to have your email addresses to be able to add you to that list, and I will do that after the session for those who are new. We said last time that we would sort of finish, but we would sort of try to get to a point where we could move on from the discussion on distance and relation. And I think it's probably a good thing to go back a little bit to the end of that text and draw out some of the things that we didn't discuss last time. And then we want to make the transition to looking at the Carl Rogers, Martin Buber dialogue. And in a way, what sort of movement I think that we can think about today is how we move from this sort of fundamental reflection on the going together of distancing and relating in this element of dialogue, or in the relation to the world and to others, how we can sort of focus that on the particular nature of the dialogic relation or relationality, the way that Buber sees it. So we should sort of try to get to one of the paths for today would be to try to think a little bit about what Buber means by dialogue and what he means by this relationality that is dialogic. Of course, these are familiar themes, but hopefully by going through it together, we will get to a sort of deeper understanding of what is at stake there. And for me, it was inspired by the idea that we've been talking a lot about how Buber fits in with this or with that, or all these elements that we talked about and need to talk about. But there is, I think there's always a need to then go back a little bit and say, okay, well, what is he trying to tell us? And not too quickly to go into this a mode of how does it relate to other things that we know or that we think we know. But let's try to stick for a moment with the real thought here. And the real thought is about something very peculiar or particular about relationality that other accounts or other philosophies do not sort of capture in quite the way in which Buber does that. And so I thought we should maybe also this session, if you're okay with that, stick a little bit to the text. and look at some of it in quite a bit of detail. But of course, so I rather than so last time we made a round and everyone spoke for a bit. Maybe right now that's not the best use of our time to do that again. But everybody should feel absolutely free to speak, because this is a joint creation, as we said. But rather than going through a round, we will just select a topic and discuss it. But also, if people want to make a contribution in the chat, as I already said, then do that. That's now open, and you can chat to sort of type something there. We can all see it. And Nathaniel is going to keep an eye on what is being posted there, and then we will get back to that after the first hour, and then maybe also shortly before the end. So does that sound okay? Yeah. Vic, do you want to say something at this point, or shall I just begin with quickly looking at the notes?
Let's look at the notes. I just wanted to say that sadly I can only be here for the first hour today. I've had a clash, which has been unfortunate. I just wanted to make that clear. So
yeah, no, that's right. That I should have said that, but that's so Vic will only be with us for the first hour. Okay, so I am going to now try to share reflections after session 2 with you. And that's this. All right. So this is just for me to go over I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but as you will remember, and this is what I sent out to people who were also here last time, as you will remember, everybody gave very thoughtful responses to this idea that in dialogue or in communication, there is first a distancing that makes the world as a world available to us. For Buber, this means that I can only start to encounter something, and this is a key word for Buber in his thinking about dialogue. I can only start to encounter something if there is, to speak a little bit metaphorically, if there is an openness within which things can come to me. And that means that there is always a distance between whatever it is that I encounter, whether it's a thing or a person or myself. There is a distance, because otherwise there would be literally no space for the encounter to happen. But there's also a relationality, so that distance becomes the basis for relating, which is not an appropriation. It's not eating up something to become part of me, but it is a relation of recognition. And this is, I think, one of the ways to start to think about what Buber is trying to say to us, which is sort of the overall theme for today. And so everybody responded to this to this text, and I tried to type it up, and then I tried to distill that into a number of themes. And I just want to quickly run over those to get them fresh in our minds, and then we can continue our discussion. So the first theme that came up is the dialogical philosophy, which is Buber's philosophy, and its relation to phenomenology and hermeneutics, although hermeneutics wasn't really mentioned in that much detail. It's an interdisciplinary group, and that's the way we want it, but there is kind of philosophical history to Buber's idea of dialogue, and that has a lot to do with phenomenology, with a description of the world as it appears to us, rather than sort of being worried about the way the world is, perhaps. And Buber draws on many phenomenological thinkers, Husserl, Heidegger, but he also distances himself from that. So what is that relation in particular? That's a topic that we introduced as important, because if you look at the text of distance and relation in detail, we see that especially in the first half, Buber uses phenomenological terminology, his notion of world, his notion of being, his notion of the self. These are strongly reminiscent of what Heidegger is writing about not a lot earlier in Sein und Zeit, and also things that Husserl is speaking of. And later on, Buber has had also an influence on the phenomenological school, especially in the figure of Levinas. So I put a nice little book there for people who are interested, by way of by Nene, Dialogue and Difference, which is a collection of essays on the relation between Levinas and Buber, and that's something that we can turn to later on. And also a wonderful book by Amit Pinchevsky, who is an Israeli philosopher of communication, by way of interruption, Levinas and the Ethics of Communication, where he uses this figure of the interruption rather than the encounter, but it's a very similar idea, to suggest that communication is not the creation of harmony or the coordination of behavior, but is rather the moment where my expectations of the world that I have constructed for myself is interrupted by someone else or something else. And it's only in that moment of interruption that dialogue happens, and that the recognition of the other as another happens. So you could say interruption is somehow related to distancing, to this primordial distance. And this is always the basic idea that we are trying to get to grips with, the implications of it, what it means when we think about Buber. And that is that for him, communication is not just coordination or sameness or understanding or fusion of horizons, or however you want to call it. It is always this going together of a separation and a togetherness. And so in terms of the ethics of communication, that's worked out beautifully with regard to the phenomenological school by Pinchevsky in that book. Next time, on the 16th of November, we are very, very fortunate to have Paul Mendes-Flohr, the what do you call him? The king of Buber studies or so, or the eminence grise, who will be with us to give a talk on the phenomenology of trust. And so we will come back to that. Then we had as a topic the I-thou relation as specifically human or as wider than that, and especially the status of the natural world, and maybe even more specifically, my cat just walks in as I say this, the status of animals in the I-thou relationship. In I and Thou, and for next time as preparation for Mendes-Flohr talk, we will ask you to read the first part of I and Thou. In that first part, Buber gives an example of a cat, and he says we can definitely have an I-thou relationship with a cat and also with a tree, but we draw these entities into the world of speech. So I can relate to my cat in a dialogical way. The cat's not going to talk back to me, but I can draw them out of the horizon or the shadow world of nature into the world of speech. And that is a thought that many of us today would find problematic. We would like to stress the fact that that we are not different from animals in such an ontologically fundamental way. And so that leads us into a number of questions around what the place of the natural world is in a philosophy of dialogue. And I think it is very important to think about that, because well, we are in a situation of a huge environmental crisis, and to ask what Buber can do for us today, for example, is in a very concrete way. We can see that when we think through the implications of the public sphere, on the public sphere of the demise of dialogue. Is there a sense in which there is a dialogue with nature that needs to be retrieved, that can be retrieved, and that would do the same thing? So that is an important question there. Which we're not going to go into, but I gave you some pointers there. Then there was the point of the dialogical philosophy and art, especially in relation to the examples that Buber gives in the text around sculpture. So nude sculpture as a relational achievement, and music and tonality. I think that's something that also requires more work for us to go into that. Hopefully we'll have the time to talk about that in future sessions. Then we had the theme of the nature of relations, interhuman relations. What is this between that Buber talks about in relation to, or in contrast with, social relations, maybe personal, communal, and collective relations. The between is something else than the social for Buber. Maybe that's something that we can turn to today. That is an important distinction that he says we have to get clear in our heads. The personal relation is something very different from the social relation. We can ask ourselves to what extent that is true. Katrina sent a poem by Piers Hutchinson to me, which I put here, which is quite nice. Because it talks about human relations, and it introduces Buber as well. And maybe Katrina, I don't want to put you on the spot, but could you maybe say something about what you thought about this poem?
Yes, I sent it to you, Johan, because I had no idea that Piers Hutchinson had mentioned Martin Buber, and I particularly enjoyed the way that he splits him. He places him at a distance from himself by making him straddle the line in an enjambment. I really liked that. And actually, just to give a bit of context on the poem, it might help to link back into issues around, I suppose, in a broader context of looking at power and asymmetries within the social context, because the poem is actually not just about an encounter, it's an encounter with what used to be called tinkers, as you can see in the first stanza, which is an ethnic minority within Ireland. Tinkers are now called the travelling community, or various different names for them, who are subject to severe discrimination and are severely disadvantaged as well within Irish society. So he's invoking Buber in the context of this, and also in the context of truth, that the encounter presents for him a dilemma for truth telling, and there isn't a simple truth. The simple truth would be that he doesn't want the apples because he doesn't like apples, but there's another truth of the encounter that actually sits in tension with the more basic truth about whether we like apples or not. So that was why I sent it.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. I think so the poem sort of highlights a lot of these things that Buber, even in Distance and Relation, talks about, where he speaks about truthfulness and he speaks about sort of authenticity. So how do we view a situation like this? It is obviously sort of drift towards an expression of authenticity in the encounter that becomes possible, exchanging heartfelt good wishes, and at the same time there is this sort of double layer in the truth of it. So I thought that was a beautiful example. And also, of course, the apple, and giving the apple, it's a very biblical scene in itself. So there's a lot there that we can turn towards when we want to look a little bit closer. So we can maybe get back to the poem today. Then there was this whole issue around gender and feminism, the use of the word man in the English translations as translation of Mensch, but as Vic pointed out, even the word Mensch in German could be considered to be sort of gendered in a masculine way. How do we think about that? And maybe in terms of historically, there's probably little, I don't know, we can look into that. There's always more to be said, but in terms of Buber's own writing, I don't know how much we can find there. But of course, it's a very important question for us today. In what sense identities, but also these differentiated identities that rely on contrasts, these binary distinctions, to what extent they intervene in the idea of dialogue. I think that's a question that we haven't even started to explore at all, and that's something that maybe we can keep that in mind. Then we talked about the absent God and the dimension of grace. Liam, who actually emailed me saying that he can't be here today, but he will be back next time. Liam noted the remark on grace in the dialogical encounter, that something happens that is no longer in our control. And Buber links that to grace, and of course that has a lot to do with the presence of the divine. And I just wanted to point out, in Distance and Relation, towards the end, in the last section, which maybe we'll look at in a minute, there is something about the relating that is an achievement. There is a will involved in relating in an empathic or dialogic way to someone or to ourselves. That's something that we can choose to do to some extent. And so there is a relation of grace and will, to use a very classic theological opposition, in the notion of dialogue. How does that precisely work? To what extent can we say that, this leads into deep questions around this distancing as a Urdistanz, as Buber calls it, this original primordial distance, as somehow a divine gift. If we look at I and Thou, it is made up of 3 parts, and there is there a definite suggestion, although it's a difficult question, but there is a definite suggestion that behind every human I-Thou relationship stands the eternal Thou, as a kind of guarantor of Thou-ness in the world that can never be corrupted. And so that becomes an important question in terms of, does the philosophy of communication, does it always or implicitly refer to a kind of religious horizon, or can we take our Buber also in a secularized way, a less heady way? So that's something that we can talk about. And then we had the theme around politics, capitalism, and what Michael Löwy calls the post-social, that there is utopian vision of community in the dialogical philosophy that tries to move beyond looking at society only in terms of social relations, and looks even at a future for society in which something else will take the place of what we now know as social relations, or fragmented relations in which people exist in more or less fragmented modes in relation to each other. And then we had the final point, and that has to do with mediated communication, and that's something, of course, that we experience very, very materially and physically now in the way that we are talking about this philosophy. What is Buber's? What is the place of dialogue in mediation, in mediated communication, and what can we learn or do with the dialogical philosophy today in thinking about the way the public sphere is developing? So these are themes, and as I wrote in my note, I would be really, I think this sort of, I tried to capture what we spoke about. If you feel there are other things, then please say so or type it up. But I try to sort of get a bit of an overview, and I think if we can keep these themes in our heads as we go on, maybe even in the second semester devote some sessions specifically to them, might do that, and some of you might feel called to prepare that a little bit. I think it would be fantastic, and we might even think, as I said, about some kind of a project towards the end in which we capture some of our thinking. So that is what I wanted to show in terms of, or share with you in terms of where we are in our thinking. And in order to now move from distance and relation to what dialogue means as it emerges from the Buber-Rogers dialogue, I think we may go back very briefly to distance and relation. So I'm going to put that up, and then we can start a discussion there. Yeah.
There's an interesting tension that's there in distance and relation.
Go on, Vic.
Between the notion of the in-between, of something that goes on between people, which can confirm a sense of people existing almost as individuals who come together, are aware of the distance that exists between, but that something happens in the space between. So that's a way that people have sometimes read I and Thou. But when we look at this last section, particularly the section 4, there's a counter reading where Buber is acknowledging how we come to be ourselves or things happen to us in relationship that brings out aspects of ourselves. So in section 4, he talks about, and I'm going to quote just a bit, I think it's on the next page. Yeah. Where just here, where he says about it's ontologically complete only when the other knows that he or she is made present by me in his or herself, and when this knowledge induces the process of his or her innermost self-becoming. So it's the issue of kind of self-becoming and how we become ourselves almost in relationship, or something is made possible, something surprises us, something unexpected happens in our relationship with others that also transforms our relationship with, or who we are in our relationship with ourselves. And then he goes on and says, for the inmost growth of the self is not accomplished as people like to suppose today in people's relationship to themselves, but in the relationship between the one and the other. So they're very complicated and important questions about how then to understand the relationship between distance and relation, and the way in which we become ourselves in those relationships. And the theme that struck me, and I don't know how to think about this well, but when Johann said very early, it's not that we appropriate other people in their relationships. We don't eat them up. That, when Johann said that, I was struck by that, because it's exactly what I've been thinking about. The way in which in a relationship with someone else, it is almost as if some physical substance passes between, and there's a sense of being nourished in a relationship. And I think Buber sometimes reaches towards that, but can be trapped in a language that makes it hard to kind of understand it. The way in which communication involves a sense of being fed or nourished in our relationship with others, that can be challenging to a particular notion, particularly of masculinities, as somehow independent and self-sufficient. So often as men, we define ourselves as not needing others, but being able to cope on our own, being on our own. And there's a way in these passages that sometimes Buber seems caught in that, and at other moments he opens up to a kind of surprising features of the way we aren't simply affirmed and confirmed in who we are, but there's something that goes on in the relationship that nourishes us, that transforms us, that makes us different from who we are. And I think in this time, that's really important to recognize how the relationship feeds us. And often it's hard to feed us in the same way on a Zoom meeting than it is in person.
Yes, that is very true. We do say, you can say to somebody that you love, I could eat you up or something. There is in the Catholic Church, of course, there is a kind of eating of the body, a kind of nurturing, in the image of the pelican, and in the relation of the mother as the one who gives life and who creates this distance in the process of giving birth, and at the same time who has there is kind of literal feeding going on in the relation between the mother and the infant.
And in that notion of feeding, often in a relationship, you want to hear certain words, or you need to hear certain words. And sometimes you never hear them. So there's a way that I'm beginning to think about the notion of words as nourishment or sources of nourishment.
Yeah.
And I remember the kind of almost a revelation at a certain period in my life when I suddenly realized, no, I'd been so identified with this notion of self-sufficiency, of being in control of myself, which particularly in a kind of postmodern, post-gendered framing means that you don't take anything in. You can subsist in your own. And I think one of the strengths of Buber is in unsettling and challenging that notion, even if not sometimes explicitly.
So this between is a very material thing. It is a concrete thing. It is maybe an embodied relationship. It is very spatialized and temporalized. And it is a concrete happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me just point out, I mean, just sort of build on that, if that's okay, that of course at the end of our text, he even uses the metaphor, or maybe it's not a metaphor. He uses the reference to bread. In this, he says sent forth from the natural domain of species into the hazard of the solitary category, surrounded by the air of a chaos which came into being with him, secretly and bashfully he watches for a yes, which allows him to be, and which can come to him only from one human person to another. And that is what happens in speech. It is from one man to another, from one person to another, that the heavenly bread of self-being is passed.
That's interesting.
And the heavenly bread, the manna, that is the word that is spoken. Yeah? It seems to me. Yeah?
And then words as bread or as forms of nourishment or things that you really need to hear, but you might never hear, or you kind of want to hear in order to become, or for some transformation to take place both in yourself but in a relationship. And I think that's there in Buber, but often it's abstracted from the social and the political.
Yes, that's right, and also from the therapeutic. So notice that in the Roger Buber dialogue, it is also about the transformative words that is heard or spoken, but he seems there to want to say that in the therapeutic relation, it is limited, whereas in the truly mutual dialogic relation, it can happen in a more unlimited way. Maybe there is a sense, I'm just thinking of the poem now that we just saw, where you can see that there is a transformative relation at work there as well. And maybe that has something to do with this double notion of truth that we noticed there.
Buber does talk about the real situation or the real context in the later discussion around with Rogers as part of a challenge to Rogers. So you wonder how Buber might read the Tinker poem or the kind of Roma, what that means in terms of what are the possibilities of mutuality when in a situation of social division or social distinctions. So the poem might be really good to return to and to see in what way we read the poem in a way that's both helped by Buber, but also questions the way that Buber talks about unequal relationships of power, and whether Buber thinks we can abstract from those relationships and treat others as human. And if we abstract from those relationships, are there ways in which, at some level, we're failing to acknowledge the way that differences are lived out? Someone's racial or ethnic background. Within a kind of Christian liberal ethic, we think we can abstract from those differences. But in the Black Lives Matter movement, we're learning again and again this summer that in showing respect and recognizing the other, you also have to be able to fully acknowledge the way in which racial and ethnic histories are part of who other people are.
I think looking again at the poem, there's something in here too about embodiment. So this one is not just an I-thou encounter. And I think the nod to Buber in the poem does frame it as an I-thou encounter or an attempt at such an encounter, but it's also a three-way encounter because he meets a man and a woman, and the male-male encounter remains perfunctory. But what really opens at the moment, the sort of epiphanic opening in the poem is the "Do you like apples?", which really situates everything in the body. So I never liked biting, so we think about his teeth and so on. So I wondered whether the question of embodied presence could be one we could return to here, sort of via the poem, perhaps. And then also the invocation of dead tradition, if you like. So my mother turning in her grave and my father dancing in his. I wondered about then this intergenerational chain, you know, so that there's an expected code or tradition of behaviors which is now being pushed back against through the power of the embodied encounter. So is that a way of framing a relationship to the past, where presence always has to weigh more heavily for us than any relationship imagined or actual that we have to our pasts?
That reminds me of
the ways in which the past is carried.
Sorry,
I was just going to say that Katrina's point reminded me of Marx's opening to the 18th Brumaire, where he talks about dead generations weighing like a nightmare on the living and so on, and reference to language and speaking in your mother tongue and so on.
Yeah.
And there's, of course, then also the gender binary, mother and father.
On the question of the in-between, in the Buber-Rogers dialogue, Buber, I think, is disagreeing with Rogers in one of many disagreements that about Rogers' idea of self-actualization, and Buber openly speaks against the notion of individuation, and he says, you know, I'm against individuals and for persons. And he says people can become more and more individual, but less and less human. And he wants people to be human. By that, he means in relation with others, with respect to others. So it is very much the connectedness to other people that makes us become more human. The in-between has to grow and develop. And simple individuation and self-actualization for him is not a positive idea.
Maybe that's a play in the poem as well. So obviously there is this moment where, despite the fact of not liking apples, which is a moment of individuation, there is a between that moves into another direction.
It also raises the question of what we mean by individuation. I agree completely that it's an issue in the Buber-Rogers. Buber tends to take a different view. And it does point out a certain weakness within a certain kind of humanistic tradition, which says, well, underneath, we're all the same. And there's a way in which the poem also speaks against that, the idea that within a certain kind of humanistic tradition, we overemphasize what is shared at the expense of recognizing what the sources of differences can be. And I think the poem actually brings that out. But also the way in which embodied, when we say the way in which histories are carried, often unknowingly, we don't realize often, or we're not aware of how we have embodied or carry histories into the present, because within a kind of liberal moral culture that encourages us to individuate, we learn quite young and quite early, but in a very formative way, to put the past behind us and to focus on goals and aspirations we have in the present, as if we can make that radical separation from the past. And I think Buber acknowledges that you can't make that separation from the past. And it's very interesting also for the talk that's going to happen in 2 weeks' time. There's a way that that relationship, his very strong relationship and his friendship with Landauer, who's the person who he refers to, who was murdered effectively in the German Revolution, that left a lasting impact on Buber and framed at some level some of his challenges to Rogers. He seems to be drawing on that particular experience, his history and how it formed him in that early relationship, in trying to become clearer about what the differences are between him and Rogers. And I think it's absolutely right. It is around the question of individuation and the question of self-realization, or the terms in which we might understand that within a liberal moral culture, and the way in which Buber's speaking out of other influences.
I also found the distinction between individuation or individuals and persons in the dialogue very helpful, in terms of picking up the thread from last time about the potential critique that we could level at some of these writings of anthropocentrism. And in fact, now I'm beginning to realize through this distinction between the individual and the person that there is this potential non-anthropocentric or not solely anthropocentric thinking of what it means to be a person really living with the world. And he says with rather than in the world, because we do not, sometimes we meet the world, he says, in other shapes than that of man. So that I found really helpful in terms of continuing on the thread that we had from last time about a kind of non or post-anthropocentric reading of Buber.
Yeah, that relationship to the tree becomes a good example of that, doesn't it? That as a person, you're in that relationship in a way possibly that Rogers finds harder to really create space for, and that Buber does have a way in that distinction between being a person that is much less anthropocentric.
Yeah, that's right.
If I might contribute just a little, my background is I'm actually an architect, and I have found Buber's writing very relevant to relationships between people and buildings and other sorts of inanimate objects, and even sort of mapping the idea of I, it, and I-you relations as being between things and also between rooms, and not just between people. So the structure itself maps onto the world. Mm. And we see the world as sort of emblematic of human relation, as well as catering to human relation. Mm. And there have been architects that have used Buber before, Aldo van Eyck. We have a gentleman from the Netherlands here who might know about Aldo van Eyck, a Dutch architect who literally cited Buber quite a lot. Yeah. And especially around the idea of the between, because architecture is nothing if it's not about betweens. So maybe I'll just stop right there.
No, thank you. That's very, very helpful, because I think that's very, very true.
I have a book out now called Architecture Beyond Experience, which is a critique of individualism, a critique of making architecture specifically, but just culturally, a matter of sort of entertaining individuals. And it tries to substitute the word relation for experience. I sort of detect experientialism as the driving force of our economy, and look forward to a sort of a more relational future. Mm-hmm. I think architecture can play a part.
I think it's definitely also in Ich und Du in the beginning, Buber contrasts relation with experience.
Yes, exactly, and I use that a lot.
Yeah, and this individual, it's in a discussion about Jung, and the way he wants to sort of in the dialogue, he wants to distance himself from Jung a little bit. Mm-hmm. But this is the modern individual that he's talking about.
Right, and I think the complete dedication of 90% of our culture to individual realization. Sort of the Rogers, most important thing in the world is you, and there's the world in you. It's a spell that's very hard to break. Very.
Yes, and it's an abstract alternative, and the other abstract alternative is the subsumption of the person in sort of a massive community, a shared identity.
Right.
Whereas
Right.
what Buber is trying
to, right, individual or crowd.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
And everyone skips over Buber, which is about pairs, triples, small groups, families, and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that is so again, sort of to dive back to the theme, that for me that is the importance of talking about communication today, is to break through that abstract alternative.
Yeah, it's huge.
I just wanted to sorry, go on.
No, it's very large, very monolithic.
Yeah,
the individualism, crowds versus individuals.
Be lovely to put some chapters or a chapter, the introduction, so that everybody could read it, Michael. That would be a lovely thing to share.
I have it in various PDFs. So
yeah, no, that'd be great. I'm struck by the question of whether or how experience necessarily relates to individual, whether it's always individual experience, and whether we have to tie it that way, or whether we can think about relationality while maintaining a more socialized sense of experience. So I see in the Rogers' account the way that experience and self-realization becomes individualized. And it might be that you can critique that notion of individualization or see what its limits are, which I think the way that Buber would frame it in terms of the limits of it, but not necessarily forsake the notion of experience, which you could retrieve.
That's a very good critique. I think the way it's set up now, though, is if you start speaking about relation, it will be in the service of enriching individual experience. So why have friends? Well, you know, why join groups? Why have seminars like this? Well, clearly it's to enhance your individual capabilities and experience. I think Buber would probably be happier to hear it go the other way around, which is the reason to have experiences is to improve our relations. It's there's something, you know, one has to be sort of like Derridianly paranoid to sort of notice that it always winds up with me, my experience, and my own realized life. And it's very difficult to reverse it and to see relation as the crucial achievement and not the experience.
Yeah.
I think
but I'm just wondering whether you can move with experience and relationship, but I don't know.
Yes, I mean, you have to, basically. You just can't talk without saying something about experience.
It refers to a Jordan, you raise your hand. Please go ahead and speak.
Yeah, thank you. I just I wondered if both can be true at the same time. I think the ideal that Buber suggests, but also what seems to be the reality of our desire or need to be an individual, but also the ideal. So that's just something that came to mind as
Buber is very, very direct about it. Experience is the world of I-it. Experience, emphasis on experience makes experiences commodity. A commodity where religious experience or an entertainment experience, or like as soon as you talk about experiences, you're in the world of I-it. And again, I don't know that I feel that that's exactly true, but it's very definitely in Buber. I can find the passages.
He sets it up as and he uses the word Erfahrung in German, and then he relates it to widerfahren, which means to something. It's the word ferrying. It's like
I see, yeah.
So you're ferrying across the world, you're surfing across the world, and stuff comes towards you, and you deal with it, and you move on. But there's no. So you're right. He sets it up as a contrast between I-it and I-thou.
Yeah.
And whatever you might say about that contrast is maybe too abstract or too much weighted to one side, or so. You could probably also say that about ervaring, experience, and relation. So not to say that the word experience cannot be salvaged in any way.
No, I agree. And I think the modern understanding of experience is much expanded.
Yeah. Fred, you had raised your hand as well. Please go ahead. Fred?
Yeah, just going back to the beginning of that section 4 in distance and relation. I think that this is a spot where Buber's talking about this idea of relation as making present. That's the central feature of relation. And then he goes on to say two things that I think are really important. One is he says it only happens very rarely. And I think that in the seminar, we sort of have been talking as if this is something that we can all sort of achieve on a regular basis. And for Buber, true relation is not, I don't think, something that happens except under exceptional circumstances. And then the other thing he says at the end of that section is that when you do achieve true relation, it's not something you can experience. As I think Michael may have said, or somebody just said, as soon as you talk about experiencing, you've moved out of true relations, and now you're back into the I-it world. So I think that contrast is really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think, but that Buber talks about living in the world of I-it with I-you on your lips and in your heart. So you're always sort of ready. It's a kind of a permanent readiness, yeah, to enter that, yeah.
Yeah, so he says, a quote from, I think it's all up on the screen now. Huh? When Tao is spoken, the speaker has no thing. He has indeed nothing, but he takes his stand in relation.
Yeah.
He said that man experiences his world. What does that mean? Man travels over the surface of things and experiences them. He extracts knowledge about their constitution from them. He wins an experience from them. He experiences what belongs to the things. But the world is not presented to man by experiences alone. These present him only with a world composed of it and he, she, and it again. I experience something. If we add inner to outer experiences, nothing in the situation has changed. I think that's very important. Yeah. Also, our inner life it can be a life of experience.
Yeah.
We are merely following the uneternal division that springs from the lust of the human race to whittle away the secret of death. Yeah, there's a bit of the language is sometimes hard to bear these days. But
so somewhere he says, "What do we experience from the I, thou, nothing, and what do we learn from it? Everything."
Yeah, exactly.
And it's that distinction between experiencing nothing but learning everything that gives such a mystical twist to Buber's.
So my profession, which is architecture, is absolutely saturated. If it's not going to be technical issues, construction and energy and so forth, with experience talk. Like buildings are there to be experienced and to manipulate your experience. In glass elevators and up and down ramps and great views, and experience talk is taken to pretty much fill up all the vacuum that's left of architecture. But it tends to leave out affection for buildings, why you regret their destruction, why you preserve them. You understand, there's like a whole dimension that's left out of the experience talk in my profession. Now, I can't speak for everyone's, obviously, but that's what struck me as worth writing about and talking about.
If we look at the poem, I think we can see the same duality or movement happening there. That the first bit up to where the woman asks the question, that is the world of experience, and then the lyrical subject is jolted out of that experience by being addressed by the woman. She speaks to him. So, and what the poem, and then something else happens. He is suddenly in relation to someone, and the whole idea of truth even shifts, or it becomes something else than just the correctness of my experiences and my preferences. It becomes what fosters the relation to become one of the heart. And the operative moment is the address. It is the word that is exchanged. That's the heavenly manna here. Yeah? So it's the apples, that's food, but it's the word. What Vic said earlier. The word is nourishing or feeding. Has the same function here, and that so it's almost as if the poem makes the crucial point almost invisible, which is the fact that a word is spoken. So this is I think I just wanted to highlight that it focuses very much on the whole poem is about this word that's suddenly spoken, the speech that is happening, but it makes it almost invisible behind this mask of or this facade of experience. The materiality of the spoken word. And I just wanted to, in one of the comments, Peter said "happy lie." That is to just dwell on the biblical references, refers in a way, so there is a kind of Genesis scene going on here. The happy lie, of course, in the Christian liturgy, there is this in the Exultet spoken around at Easter. There is this phrase of Felix culpa, the fortunate guilt that gave us has to do with this apple, with eating eating the apple. The Felix culpa, the fortunate guilt that gave us the Redeemer. Yeah?
I was going to ask, why does he not like biting apples? Who doesn't like? What kind of person doesn't like to bite apples?
I don't like biting apples. I really was happy to read this poem, but all my life I hated eating apples.
Oh, really?
Finally, I meet someone I didn't know the poem who also know. I know exactly what he means. It is one of the
must have to do with your mother, Jan.
Yeah, no, that's
lie down.
That's weird. That's what my analyst keeps saying too. Yeah. So I think that it's interesting to see that this notion of the materiality of speech that sort of comes to the fore here, and that also is present in this speech that is passed as the heavenly bread. And indeed, as Fred points out, this is not something that is so easy or that's even in our control. All the time, although there is a kind of will involved, and he says that in this section, that there is also a kind of there's something else that has to come into it, and the moment we think too easily about controlling it, then maybe we slip into the kind of I-it account of dialogue, which can be kind of a paradox in itself. Nathaniel, can I just ask you maybe to try and summarize a little bit, because there's so much been going on in the comment section. But is this a good time to do that? And then we move into the second hour.
Yeah, there were a number of questions and comments. A lot of it seemed to relate back to the poem, actually. But Fred posed a question right at the beginning. I'm not sure if he covered it when he was speaking there, but he asked whether distancing in Buber might also mean boundary creating. So he suggests that we don't mention boundaries anywhere as fundamental to the notion of distancing. And then Peter suggested that the dialogue with Buber and Rogers actually touches on this question of boundaries. And I asked a question about individuation, but I think that was covered. Marcus asked a question about whether there's anything been written about the relationship between Buber and his wife, in maybe touching on the gendered nature of relationality, I think. And Anastasia asked, based on Katrina's observation, about embodied presence as not just being presence, but the actual distance as presence, as in the current digital context. I'm sorry if I misrepresented that. Wasn't. Yeah, and then yeah, Peter's mention of the poem that you've already covered.
Yeah.
And then there were some other comments about architecture from Federico. But yeah, I think imperfectly kind of covered the general gist. but obviously I don't want to speak for people. They can come in and if I've got
Okay.
things wrong. Yeah.
Okay, is there anyone who wants to sort of raise their point verbally now as well? Okay, good. And if you want to just interrupt, or raise your hand, I should have said that, but I'm very happy that 2 people did that. That's a really good sign, because I'm sitting here like a pilot in a cockpit managing all these screens. If I see raise hand, then I know somebody's trying to wants to say something. So that was very helpful. Thank you for that. So on the basis of this discussion, maybe we are sort of beginning to get a little bit closer to what this between is, and also how prone we are to maybe understand it in the wrong way, or maybe to be too intellectual about it. And how it is mediated by speech. And I think that maybe could be a starting point to now look a little bit more at this Rogers-Buber dialogue. But like I always say, before I do that, I want to just highlight this notion of speech, to sort of get that sort of clearly foregrounded, how important that is. And for me, that's also something that I just think about a lot. Because we remember, or for those of you who haven't read the text, let me just show you in I and Thou. So we must never forget that it is not just a philosophy of dialogue, in the sense that the relationality between the I and the Thou, which can happen in silence, as Buber also points out in the Buber-Rogers dialogue, but it is something that is essentially verbal, that has an essential way to do with the word. And in the beginning of I and Thou, that becomes very clear. He says these 2 attitudes, I, Thou, and I, it, are primary words. And primary words are word pairs. That the I in I, Thou is a different I from the I in I, it. Primary, because the I in I, Thou is whole, and you don't know anything about it. It's not knowledge. Whereas the I and I, it, just like the it, is fragmented and categorized. The subject of judgment, the subject of causal analysis, is an object. I already pointed out that this sounds very familiar to those who know a bit about the history of philosophy, the Kantian opposition between nature and morality. But I tend to think that for Buber there is a kind of neo-Kantian atmosphere in his earlier writings. But he's obviously trying to say more, because he wants to. He makes it quite clear that that this is a matter of words, and I just want to highlight that. But I'm showing you 2 other little quotations, and then we go to the Buber-Rogers dialogue. He has, in I and Thou, he says primary words do not signify things, so they are not significations, but they intimate relations. They hint at relations, and they put us into relations. They do not describe something that might exist independently of them, so they are not the words of words and things, as it were, but being spoken, they bring about existence. So how do we speak the basic words? What sort of speech is involved in that? We don't go around saying I, it, or I, thou. So that's I'm going to answer that question. I'm going to put it out there. Primary words are spoken from the being. The primary word I, thou can only be spoken with the whole being. So you put yourself into it. You put yourself on the line. The primary word I, it can never be spoken with the whole being. At the moment I have an objective or experiential relation to the world, I am removed from the connection with it, in the sense that I'm not fully present with it. When a primary word is spoken, the speaker enters the word, and takes his stand in it. So these are very, I think, very mysterious or maybe mystical ideas that sort of require us to think about what they might mean. And this is the Buber's early text, of course, from the 20s, or early, not early, but in this sort of dialogical thinking early text. In between man and the knowledge of man, from which distance and relation comes, the next chapter is called the elements of the interhuman. And there he makes this distinction, which we introduced and which the Vic started to sort of criticize a little bit, between the social and the interhuman. And I think it's maybe important to just highlight that when we, as preparation of going to the Buber-Rogers dialogue, and again, sort of focusing on speech. So he starts by saying, it is usual to ascribe what takes place between people to the social realm. So the between and the social, thereby blurring a basically important line of division between two essentially different areas of human life. He says, I made that mistake myself because it's so it's hard to see because it's always there. We may speak of social phenomena wherever the life of a number of people lived with one another, bound up together, brings in its train shared experiences and reactions. So these are the experiences, and this is also the sharing. The shared experience, we all feel the same, or we're caught up in the same dispute or whatever it is. This is a social phenomenon. And that is the sphere of this sort of way of thinking about communication as creating togetherness. And that is not the between. That is sharing an experience. Sympathy instead of empathy is not the between. But to be thus bound up together means only that each individual existence is enclosed and contained in a group existence. And he is talking about the personal relation, not as a group existence, but as a personal relation of encounter. And then we get, I'm just going quickly, you can read this, it's in the folder. Then he begins to talk about how he became clear of this relation, and that is the experience of the relation with Landauer, who we won't go over that now, that historical thing, who was murdered in the failed German Revolution. I just want to point out that he then starts to talk about what this interhuman realm is, and that is our task, as it were, to sort of ask ourselves, what is this between? In the poem, I think the poem is really brilliant. It also, the second half of the poem is about that between, because that's where the exchange between the woman and the poet happens. The realm of the interhuman goes far beyond that of sympathy. We may even want to suggest that his happy lie wasn't an instance of sympathy, but of empathy. Such simple happenings can be part of it, as for instance, when two strangers exchange glances in a crowded streetcar, at once to sink back again into the convenient state of wishing to know nothing about each other. So it's not based on a close knowledge of the other person. And that fits with what we just highlighted, that experience or knowledge, that's not relation. And he says it here again in slightly different terms. As a crude example, take two people who are observing one another. The essential thing is not that the one makes the other his object, but the fact that he is not fully able to do so, and the reason for his failure. We have in common with all existing beings that we can be made objects of observation. But it is my privilege as a person, we might want to say, that by the hidden activity of my being, I can establish an impassable barrier to objectification. Only in partnership can my being be perceived as an existing whole. And so let me just say as a side remark, our concern about nature, that Buber says the nature is somehow less than human. I think we have seen that there are ways of overturning it. Maybe the interesting suggestion that Buber has for us today is that we learn to see that this hidden activity of our being, that this pervades the natural world. So rather than to say we should objectify ourselves just as we have objectified nature, no, we should subjectivize nature just as we can learn to dialogically subjectify ourselves. And then we're almost through with this, but I just want to make an important, I think, an important observation. Then he starts to talk about sociology, of course, as sort of wanting to, out of the nature of what social theory is, wanting to reject this separation of the social and the interhuman, on the ground that society is actually built upon human relations, and the theory of these relations is therefore to be regarded as the very foundation of sociology. And now we get in, I think, where speech comes in. But here an ambiguity in the concept relation becomes evident. So there are we talk about two things when we talk about relation. We speak, for instance, of a comradely relation between two people in their work, and do not merely mean what happens between them as comrades, as friends, but also a lasting disposition, which is actualized in those happenings and which even includes purely psychological events, such as the recollection of the absent comrade. There's a disposition in friendship. When my friend is not there, I might think about them and have warm feelings about them, or maybe when I hate them, not so warm feelings in the moment. But it is a lasting disposition. Yeah? But, and this is not the dialogic encounter, the other person doesn't even have to be there for me to have my warm feelings about them. But by the sphere of the interhuman, I mean solely actual happenings between people, whether wholly mutual or tending to grow into mutual relations. And that might be something to think about the therapeutic situation. For the participation of both partners is in principle indispensable. The sphere of the interhuman is one in which a person is confronted by the other. We call its unfolding the dialogical. In accordance with this, it is basically erroneous to try to understand the interhuman phenomena as psychological. When two people converse together, the psychological is certainly an important part of the situation as each listens and prepares to speak, but it's a hidden accompaniment to the conversation itself. This phrase, I've always remembered that as one of the most meaningful in all of Buber's work. This between is a phonetic event, and you couldn't put it in a more embodied way. It is a phonetic event. It is about not just a mystical sense in which we stand in a word, but the way we stand in a word when we use our body to produce it. Fraught with meaning, whose meaning is to be found neither in one of the two partners nor in both together, but only in the dialogue and is between which they live together. And so all of this to point out that we cannot sort of think in a concrete way enough about the dialogic as a here and now situation of speaking and listening. And it's only from that point of view that we can start to begin to see, I think, I hope you agree with that, or maybe let me know, that the whole sphere of social relations is something different from this kind of interhuman situation. And also how that might mean that we can speak to cats. So that is a preparation in terms of sensitizing ourselves to what Buber means when he talks about speech or the spoken word. And maybe we can then now move to the Rogers Buber dialogue. Yeah. Right. So how are we going to approach this? Who would like to start with?
Well, Johan, are you suggesting that a cat also uses language, or a cat speaks, or a tree? I just want to know if you're privileging utterance and the phonetic event. How do we achieve relations with things that cannot produce?
Yeah, so we can talk to them, for example, which is maybe our way of relating. We do when we are, let's say, when Buber discusses the example of the tree, he talks about the difference between looking at the tree as an exemplar of a species subject to these and these chemical processes, and we can measure everything about the tree and yet not experience. And yet not, so we can experience everything there is to experience about the tree, and yet not encounter the tree as this particular tree here. That's
There's
how
also a passage somewhere, I don't know where it is, where he talks about a printer relating to his printing machine, the massive press, and he can hear that its machine is running well.
That's right.
You can just like listen to its health in a way.
Yeah, and also ideas. We can also relate in this way to ideas.
Yeah.
And sort of when I was just trying to emphasize, when I was trying to explain how we can become sensitive to the distinction between the social and the spoken, or the social and the interhuman, I had an experience of sort of being in touch with the particularity of that idea, and I tried to communicate that to you. But Buber, Rogers would say in another text, which we also put in the folder, that don't try to do that. That's doomed to fail. But I think we have to observe that when we are in this kind of relationship to the particularity of the world that surrounds us, the world that we are with, then we do talk to things. We talk to animals. We talk to trees.
I know I do. I talk to trees.
Yeah. So I think we
they
all
talk
do
to
that.
me.
So
I believe they talk to me, which means I probably need help.
Well, with learning different different tree dialects.
So there's a very interesting question: what is the nature of the helping relationship in this text that we're looking at? And maybe you do need help, but maybe that is the first step to wisdom.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just note that it's very interesting that Rogers comes across as quite defensive in this, which is something that I wouldn't have expected. So that really interested me in how he was sort of always trying to say, but it is, and Martin Buber would push back. It was a wonderful dialogue, but I was very interested in that, well, not so much an undercurrent really, but in that sort of denial a bit, that a therapeutic relationship is a helping relationship, yes, but actually I do meet them. Well, it's not, it felt like he was trying to deny that power dynamic in there a little bit.
Yeah, that's true. So to what extent can it be a phonetic event with a tree instead of if it's not just me talking to the tree? Well, I think maybe we should take phonetic here then maybe a little bit wider but there has to be a kind of concrete materiality that is in the here and now. Or even when that is ideational, it is about a spatio-temporal concreteness that is always there, and not an imagined relationality or thinking about the past in which there was a relation or about the future in which there will be a relation. It is about this moment here and now, and it's only through that narrow gate that the dialogical opens up. And so maybe phonetic is maybe we should not take it to mean literally prioritizing the voice or the articulation, but we should take it in terms of maybe slightly wider sense of voice as what comes expressively from the body in the here and now. And a cat expresses itself totally clearly in that way and uses voice, of course, very often. And a tree, well, even there is a kind of something going on that you can experience in terms of the repose of the tree in its resting in itself. That can become something you encounter. Carmen,
may
your hand.
Oh, sorry.
Would you say, for example, when he talks about the sword and this man that puts a sign in the sword or in this instrument at the beginning of the times, could you say that, and I understood that he was talking about the origins of art. Could you say that this is also a relationship with it? In this case, I'm putting a sign in something that I pretend to be mine, or there is a relationship between me and this instrument. Does that it's in relation with what you were talking about when you talked about the tree.
Where is that?
I don't remember. I think in the text that I read about relation.
Wasn't it early
distance and relation? Distance and relation.
The person who decorates the sword, right?
Yes, yes, I'm talking about that. Yeah, and he talks about why does this man or this person decorate a sword with a sign, because of a magical reason maybe, or because he or she pretends that this sword is his or hers. So there is a relation also.
Yes. Okay, yeah, definitely, yeah. So what was the question?
If art, the creation of art, I'm trying to go further to the example and thinking about, for example, about the stories that is my field. Stories, audiovisual stories or written stories, are ways of expressing a relation with something that is at the beginning is an it, because it's something written or filmed, but the relationship is not I, it, but more similar to I, thou.
Yes, yeah, definitely, yes. And so also these artifacts can have that relationship. Yeah, and the story is a medium in which this can be expressed.
Yeah, magical objects, especially.
Yeah. Okay, let's keep that in mind for a second. Iram, I'm going to come back to your defensiveness remark, but Federico and Fred have raised their hands as well. So first Federico, then Fred, and then we'll go back to the dialogue itself and to what's going on there.
Yeah, so just to further on the phonetic bit, we've already commented in the dialogue between Rogers and Buber. One thing that struck me is that observation by Buber when he says that dialogue is not just talking, but also silence can be part of dialogue. So it's not necessarily phonetic in that sense as well. So he talks on page 175. He says dialogue can be silence. We would perhaps without the audience. I would recommend to do it without an audience. We can sit together, or rather walk together in silence, and that could be a dialogue already.
Yeah.
And again, the passage in I thou, at the beginning of I thou, you've quoted, says where Buber talks about primary words. It doesn't describe the word in the way a linguist would do. He says something as primary words are spoken from the being. So in both these passages, it seems that we have to abandon the framework of linguistics when we understand what word is, what dialogue is. But I do agree that a certain degree of physical embodied presence is needed, seems to me to be needed by the two people entering in this relationship. So any time when Buber talks about dialogue, he talks about a situation between two human beings and a relation of the almost of their embodied presence, or even towards an object. That there must be a corporeal experience in it. It seems to me.
Yes, I would thank you for emphasizing that. So when we read phonetic event, it doesn't mean that Buber is telling us that we should all become phoneticians if we want to understand the dialogue. Yeah, so we have to liberate that word a little bit into that direction of a concrete, some kind of an articulation, which you might understand that the ontological. If you ask yourself, what does it mean to say a word from your being? I'm led to think about the surplus. So in things, something is more than what it is, and that is what we encounter in speech.
Yeah, and I think this is the element he touches upon in the same dialogue with Rogers, when he talks about surprise as being the main element of the dialogue. So there is this element of surprise, which is at the same time novelty, it seems, so something that is brought into the relation, or that emerges from the relation that wasn't present before, as if me as an individual, as being constituted as an individual, I'm not completely sufficient to myself, and I need this external element to become a person.
Yes,
and this external element comes as surprise. And I couldn't but think about marvel, surprise in terms of marvel, and in that case, all the artistic art crafts or artworks can be a source of this this form of marvel and this form of surprise. Therefore, we can enter into dialogue with art, for example, precisely in this sense, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's right. I think these are very important things, and they also help us to free our thinking. So we have to learn to think about beings as somehow overflowing with something that's not part of them and is part of them. And that's where this relationality, this marvel can happen. That's where the encounter then happens. You see it even in remember in Genesis, when after the Adam and Eve ate from the tree, they hide. And then you get this strange moment where God says to Adam, "Adam, where are you?" And that is kind of God knows everything. He knows where Adam is. What has happened is that this primordial distance has entered into things, which makes possible, but also requires relationality to happen as a phonetic event, the way that Buber then tries to think about it. So. Yeah, just to emphasize that is, I completely agree with that, Federico. Fred, you had your hand up as well.
I was going to ask you to say something more about intersubjectivity in relationship to this conversation we were having a moment ago about interacting with things other than people. Because it seems to me that as you mentioned in your summary from the first meeting, that the dialogical principle as the basis of intersubjectivity would take on a completely different sense. Yes, if we were talking about in relationship, let's say, to a tree or to a cat or to some inanimate object. Do you want to talk about that a little or not?
No, but I'll do it anyway.
Yeah, watch out, I'll jump in.
No.
That's dialogue.
It'll all come out in the wash, I guess. But I think maybe what is good to say now is that if we think back to the end of Distance and Relation, where Buber talks about becoming yourself, becoming self through what the other speaks to you, then I think that sort of starts to we can open that up to the non-human world. So just as in the relation with the tree, there is a kind of becoming self, not just of me, but also of the tree, in my relation to the tree and the tree's relation to me, that we can live with. That can be a form of witness, and that would actually also change our relation to the natural world quite fundamentally, if we learned to see the natural world as a site of this exchange through which we may become selves. I think one of the tricks to do in general, we always have the tendency when we one of the lessons of philosophy, when you encounter something that it has this surprise element to it, you try to relate it to something you already know. So you open up a book by Buber, you see dialogue, you think, intersubjectivity. But what you have done then is try to explain something, dialogue, which can surprise us if we think about what it really means, by relating it back to something you think you already know, namely inter as relation and subject as, yeah, we are all subjects. To explain dialogue by reference to intersubjectivity is what Whitehead would have called fallacy of misplaced concreteness. You take something concrete, dialogue, that Buber tries us to get to sensitize us to, and you try to understand it by reducing it to an abstract theoretical term. You're not really explaining, you're just categorizing. So you're reducing the dialogue phenomenon to an I-it thing that you think you understand. And I think that's a real problem in a lot of Buber scholarship, and of course, as a scholar, you have to do this sort of stuff. But to say, oh, I-it is subject-object and I-thou is subject-subject, that is world upside down. That doesn't explain anything. It just makes you think that you understand something, but you haven't really engaged with what the phenomenon is about. And so I would like to approach it in those terms, because if we started, and that's also why it's important, even it's not about agreeing with everything that Buber says, but it's about allowing this language and these ideas to speak to us in a dialogical way. Then we can maybe begin to understand how what he says actually does provide an alternative way of thought out of these typical modern configurations of subjectivity, objectivity, intersubjectivity, etc. I don't think that really is an answer to your question, but it's how I would like to sort of approach texts like this, and sort of to keep a little bit at bay the tendency to reduce it to something we already know, and try to let it speak to us, and then see what happens, and then we might find a way to also think about these other questions around the non-human world. But it's more like a program than a real answer to your question, but I can't say anything more at this point in time, I think. We have 3 more raised hands. So we have Jose first.
No, I just raised it now.
Oh, you just raised it now. We have Katrina first.
Yeah, thanks. It follows on.
And then Carmen, and then Jose. Yeah, please.
Sorry, it just follows on from precisely what you were saying there about surprise. And I was wondering, why is it? It's part of our academic training, I suppose, which is a training in defensiveness. If we think of the viva voce, which is the rite of passage we all have to go through, it's a defensio. So we learn how to be defensive. And then it's almost like we have to unlearn that and allow ourselves the vulnerability of being surprised and maybe not being always able to map something we encounter in a text or in another person onto something we already know. And to me, that's, and I'm actually about to do exactly what I've just said. I find it really helpful because that's exactly what Gadamer is talking about when he talks about hermeneutic conversion, which is when we read a difficult poem and we translate it into the abstract sort of prose translation of itself. We render it in prose and we thereby say or think or suppose that we've understood it or done something with it. And actually all we've done is abstract it rather than sit with its difficulty, which is another way of being in presence. And what I was really struck by reading the dialogue, sorry, we had a nice back and forth about, one of them is confrontational, the other is defensive, but I think all of us picked up on a tension in this dialogue. And what I really liked was how Buber pushes back at any attempt to abstract him and turn him into some sort of quotable label. He says on more than one occasion, I'm not a quoted man who thinks so and so and so. Yeah. And then he says it again because he clearly feels that Rogers is trying to pigeonhole him in some way and turn him into a quoted man. And the other opposition he uses that I'd love to unpick a bit more if people also are interested in it is the opposition between shut and opened. So what is it precisely that Buber means when he opposes shutness to openness in these encounters?
Yeah, great. Let's keep that in mind. Carmen, you also had your hand raised, and Jose.
I'm not.
Oh, okay. Your hand is still up. That's your legacy hand.
Okay.
Jose.
Hi, sorry. I'm afraid of doing this question, but I have to. I know that you will not have a proper answer for it, but I have to do it because of my deformation. So I spent too many years studying philosophy, and now I'm reading Buber, and something is turning around. So my question is Buber project an anti-Platonic project? Is that what in the real sense of the okay? It's Buber trying to reinvert all the process of philosophy has been built during 2,500 years.
That is such a good question. I mean, I'm in no position to answer it.
I missed the word. An anti-what project?
Platonic.
Platonic. Sorry, I have a flu, so.
So is Buber and an anti-Plato? And I mean, that is, I can't begin to answer that question, but I can maybe give a few pointers for that can occupy us later as well. There is, of course, the original figure of dialogue is Socrates, and Buber mentions that also in I and Thou, and he sort of tries to establish Socrates as an I-Thou dialoguer, which is maybe a little bit forced. If we all know the Platonic dialogues, it's usually Socrates talking and everybody else saying, yes, of course, how could it be otherwise, etc., etc. But he tries to highlight that there is a real dialogic atmosphere in these dialogues. Iris Murdoch also writes about that, about the open, happy, sunny atmosphere in the Platonic dialogues, that there is a real openness, which maybe has to do with this openness, also that Katrina, that you mentioned, as opposed to shutness. And that sort of speaks through the text. So I think that is an important line of thinking about how Buber related to Plato. I think he also experienced in Plato a kind of awareness of the dialogical possibility of relating dialogically, to ideas and to art and in beauty. He has a discussion with Friedman about beauty in which he refuses to define beauty. And I think so he would see Plato as somebody who is very tuned into that level of experience. But the moment Plato turns it into a monologue, the whole monologic tradition in philosophy starts in a way there. Then, of course, he would become critical of that. But it's too simple, and maybe would be my answer. It's too simple to say it is anti-Platonic in the sense in which Nietzsche is anti-Platonic. It tries to listen to what goes on in Plato's dialogues in a way that draws out the real dialogical soul in it that is buried as well in the process itself. So it's a good example of shutness and openness at the same time. Plato's a kind of paranoid dialogical thinker, maybe. It's a good question. I like that. Okay, so let's go back to this dialogue, and indeed, a great observation that there is this tension there going on, and we all sense that. What does that mean? There is this. Buber does a lot in terms of resisting this, as Katrina, as you said, this being a quotable person. In a way, I felt also he is also trying to, in a weird way, he is almost trying to show by example what he means in his relation with Rogers himself. So that it is not a therapeutic encounter, but it's almost as if he's saying, look what I'm doing now with you. This is not a therapeutic encounter. This is a dialogue. I'm making life possible for you in this moment. And maybe Roger's also doing the same for him. So I felt that the whole thing sort of reflects back in itself all the time. Katrina, you said shut and open, that we should discuss that more. Can you say something about what you were thinking there?
Could you just scroll?
Yeah, I'm going to find it.
The version that had been copied into a Word document, so I don't have page numbers.
Where is it?
It's when he's discussing paranoia, I think.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Rogers, this is the first point.
Yeah, here we have it.
I suppose the openness and shutness connects to
here it is, at the
they're
bottom.
talking, oh yeah, well, maybe if we find the passage and have a closer look at it, but I think the openness and shutness connects to what they're saying about, or to what Buber is saying about transformation. So they seem to have quite a back and forth on the question of acceptance. So if I accept you as you are, I accept you as you are, and this was something we picked up on the last time as well. So this, the person in the way that they are, this dieser Mensch ist so beschaffen, that's fundamental to the encounter, but that does not mean I do not want you to change. So what might be the relationship between acceptance then and transformation?
Yeah, because he does say that I can want you to change, or it can even be our long-term dialogical relation can be my wish that you change.
Yeah, and somewhat problematically, that's mapped on to a patriarchal marriage relationship.
Precisely.
The husband, by his accepting love, will discover in the wife what she
needs to change in her.
Yeah, but on the shut part on 175, if we could scroll, so the paranoiac is shut. There's something else being done to him that shuts him. Being shut. And the problem is if he can be opened, if he can open himself.
It's the context is the question about schizophrenia and paranoia, and they are presented almost as a kind of total bifurcation of the mental realm. And Buber then tries to say the schizophrenic, I don't think it's a word we use in that sense anymore either, but the schizophrenic, you can at least talk with the schizophrenic, but the paranoiac you can't, because they are shut by something else. He is shut.
So what would be the possibility for becoming open and get so there's something in the chat about surprise.
Yeah, and this is a problem for the human in general. Yeah. So would it be possible to say that paranoia is a fragmented relation to the world, not being with the world, but being to the world, and is therefore maps onto the I-it relationship. If we were to think of a person only in an I-it relation to themselves and the world, they would be under the spirit of trying to find an unambiguous statement about what things are and how they are, precise signification, calculation, control, and therefore they would be unable to meet anyone that surprises them, because everything would already be categorized in terms of what they already know. And that's paranoia in the literal sense of what is annexed to knowing, to thinking, which is it's a non-genuine form of knowing, but at the same time, so he seems to contemplate here the idea that you can be shut in that way, in which it becomes impossible to find a way out of it. I hesitate to say that this is where the relation to the divine comes in, but that would be a way out of it, because God is that which can never, in the classic formulation that Buber gives, is that which can never become an it. And so as when God speaks to us and we hear it, then we are out of just the I-it relationship, and it would make his critique of modernity sort of one of the paranoia of modernity, and that might actually be very relevant suggestion in terms of surveillance culture, and which is kind of total paranoia that we are living in.
And also conspiracy theories, which also assimilate all available evidence to the confirmation of an already existing narrative.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, and it's a moment of surprise that is precisely what from the paranoid position, what you could never allow to be. But and then the question for the helping relation becomes then, how can I help someone in that situation not by talking, not by explaining them what's wrong or something, but by being there, being with them, and that is what then becomes so difficult. I cannot go on. At the same, only a terrifying strong man is gives the paranoid. He does not open himself, does not shut himself, he is shut. This terrible fate very strongly, I feel this very strongly because the world of normal people, there are just analogous cases. I mean, doesn't this border on the discussion of grace that we hinted on last time? That there seems to be a moment in the dialogic relation that is radically out of control, and yeah, does that make sense?
I'm trying to connect that up to the point that was made earlier in the chat about, that if we over focus on the here and now, that also carries risks with it. So it's not a kind of shutting out of legacy or the past or a foreclosure of the future. It would have to be a being in the here and now that was not shutting, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Peter raised his hand, and Daniel as well. Peter first.
I was sort of wondering how Katrina's question about the open and shut passage does or doesn't connect with something else from earlier in the dialogue that I found sort of interesting. Buber's emphasis on what he called the objective situation in which the therapist and the patient meet. Because when he says that the paranoiac is shut and describes it as a terrible fate, that begins to sound like another sort of objective situation. There are these facts of the relationship that just are part of the relationship that can't be changed necessarily, or at least are difficult to change. And you can almost read, I actually sort of appreciated Buber's emphasis in that objective situation, but you can almost read Rogers as pushing back in a kind of Buberian fashion to ask whether the possibility of dialogue itself whether dialogue doesn't enclose the possibility of reshaping the objective situation in some fashion. And so that open shutness, I think, links back to this, what's also a question for me as to how we understand the relation between that objective situation and the very possibility of dialogue itself.
Yeah, I see your point. Katrina, do you have a response to that? Do we want to respond to that or not? No? Daniel?
Just to take up the question of here and now and overemphasis, I think Buber is challenging Rogers on unconditional acceptance of a person as they are, because Buber sees potentiality is not, and potentiality to say yes or to say no. I mean, I would put it, I wonder if it's influenced by the idea, the Jewish notion of evil inclination and good inclination, and we are there to encourage the good inclination. In other words, I think Rogers sees us as basically that we're uncovering the goodness by accepting people as they are, and Buber isn't convinced, I think, by people being so good, but rather that they have potentialities, and the therapist may be helping the patient, the client, to say yes to what is life affirming and to what is open rather than shut. So Buber is less accepting. I mean, he does accept, but he sees it as a starting point, not as an ending point.
Yes, and he also emphasizes the polarity in people. Huh? Yeah.
Although he does refuse the term life affirming for precisely what you're talking about there, Daniel, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And yes, I can't suggest an alternative. I can't remember what it is now.
Confirmation, right?
Yeah, confirmation.
Yeah, can I just jump in at this point? I mean, I'd like to comment on what Daniel Smith said about point in this direction, and so Buber being less accepting. I think there is a moral point there in the dialogue. So there's a point about morality, and that point in the dialogue made me think about another observation that Buber the Buber wrote in the introduction to the Legend of the Baal Shem, when it talks about intention or kavanah in that context. So because I think in this dialogue he explicitly says that he doesn't see good and bad as something with content, but rather with a direction. And he makes more or less the same point in Legend of the Baal Shem, when it talks about the intention. So no matter what is the action in which a human being is involved, what matters is the intention that there is in that action. And then in that context, he specifies that the intention is the direction towards redemption. And I think that this is the way also to, maybe there is a way of linking this moral point to openness and to being shut. So in a way, the way human being can be open is precisely by retaining this intention. I think maybe I'm pulling two things together, which will need some more passages, but I think there is this connection.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think that's a very good suggestion, to see the openness and the shutness not just at the level of the individual relationship, but also the place of humanity in the world, or maybe the world itself, as somehow having a messianic intention. Yeah. That's a very good suggestion. That's something that we sort of keep stepping over this social and political thing, but I think we do need to also find our way back to that, because that will have to do with this. Nathaniel, we're approaching the end of our session. Nathaniel, can I ask you to quickly run through the comments, if there's anything there that we haven't picked up?
So there was a question that Jordan posed, and that a few other participants commented on, about the relationship between silence and vulnerability. So kind of questioning that relationship there. And then Jason had a long comment, but I don't want to kind of just read it out. So I don't know if Jason maybe wants to come in about the relationship between, I think it was between therapy and history, but yeah, the only question that really emerged was the one that Jordan posed around, the connection between vulnerability and silence.
Okay, what was that question? What is that relation?
Yeah, it was just what's the connection between the two, I guess was what he was asking.
Okay. Yes, well, of course you can hide your vulnerability by yapping all the time. And so in that sense, being silent can be a way to learning to open up to that. But silence can also be the mode of it can be the contact, it can be the dialogue itself.
And in fact, one gets the sense when their conversation isn't really going very easily, that's what Buber is suggesting. You know, if it weren't for the audience and the fact that this is an invited event, we would go for a walk in silence, and that would actually achieve more effectively what that was.
Yeah, precisely, exactly. Yeah. And in the other example, in the life of dialogue, he starts almost with that the two people meet each other, they don't know each other, they sit next to each other, but there is an empathy, and that allows something fundamentally to shift in the heart of one of them. That's the same point, exactly. Thanks for pointing that out. Okay, it's 1 minute past 6, so we are going to draw to a close. Thank you all very much for your participation. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot from it. I hope that it's the same for you. Next time, as I said, we will have our guest talk by Paul Mendes-Floor, who will speak about the phenomenology of trust. Vic and I were talking about the reading to prepare for that, and we feel that it would be good to go back to the first part of I and Thou as a kind of reading for that talk. But there's also a lecture by Mendes-Floor on, which is a bit more philosophical, historical, the relation between Buber and Heidegger, and I've put a link in the notes that I sent around. So if you want to prepare a little bit by looking at Mendes Floor's work, then that would be a good place to start. And that relationship between Heidegger and Buber is in itself also very instructive for our understanding of Buber himself. So please have a look at both of those things, but I'll send out an email with the details for the next session as well. Thanks all for participating. It's great to see you all, and I'm looking forward very much to seeing you all back in 2 weeks' time.